I'm your warm-up act tonight. Warren's the main event. And to get you into the mood, I thought I would start by emphasising just how important this referendum on the voice will be. Because the voice needs to be put in context. It is the first step in our broader program. The Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for voice, treaty and truth. An Indigenous voice enshrined in the Constitution, that's what the referendum's about. A treaty with First Nations people, which at a minimum will have some form of recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty, and reparations for alleged past sins. And a truth commission, an Orwellian Department of Truth, indoctrinating our kids into a certain view of Australia's colonial past. If this program gets implemented, what next? Well, I think we can say goodbye to our national flag and Australia Day. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said that should he win the next election, in his next term of office, he will introduce a referendum on the Republic. So we are on the cusp of the most momentous changes to our country ever seen. In the span of 2 parliamentary terms, we will have enshrined racial division and privilege into our Constitution, required some Australians to pay money to other Australians because of what their ancestors did, and removed the symbols of national unity, our flag, Australia Day, and the stabilising effect of the monarchy. After this, the country will not be the same one I was born into. It will have different values and a different system of government, one that prioritises division, group identity and shame for our past, instead of promoting unity, individual rights and love for our great country. That is why this referendum is such a great opportunity. An opportunity to send a signal to Canberra that most Australians are not interested in radically changing their country. How bad might the voice be? Well, the IPA's international research might be enlightening. Our research on international comparisons came across a proposal to amend the Constitution of the United States. This proposal was put forward by Mr. Ibram X. Kendi. You may have heard of him. He wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. What is anti-racism? Anti-racism is another word for racial equity. And racial equity is another word for communism. Equity requires equality of outcomes. All outcomes, whether measured by income, wealth, employment, university admissions, directorships of company boards, health statistics, incarceration rates, all social outcomes must be equal between racial groups. Mr. Kendi wrote in 2019, to fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the US Constitution. What was he proposing? The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. So it would be unconstitutional to have different outcomes between racial groups above a threshold, and unconstitutional to hold racist ideas. How would this be enforced? Well, Mr. Kendi proposed enshrining in the US Constitution a Department of Anti-Racism. I will set out the powers that he proposed, but I'll give it a bit of a brand change. Instead of calling it the Department of Anti-Racism, I'll rename it The Voice. The Voice to Congress would be comprised of formally trained experts in racism. The Voice would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity. The Voice would monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. The Voice would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. Pretty sinister stuff. Coleman Hughes, an African-American podcast host and critic of Kendi's, has written, "Make no mistake, If totalitarianism comes to the West, it won't be the fascism or communism of the 20th century, it will be the anti-racism of folks like Kendi. Is it fair of me to compare Kendi's fantasy with the very real possibility of a voice of Parliament enshrined in our Constitution? Am I being alarmist? Well, I don't think so, as long as the voice can meet three preconditions. One, the voice will have to have a degree of binding legal power. Two, the voice will have to push an activist racial agenda. And three, there must be a breakdown of ordinary democratic norms for such an undemocratic institution to be accepted. I'll go through all three preconditions. Will the voice be binding? The claim is that the voice will be just an advisory body. But our research on New Zealand might be instructive on this. New Zealand has been on the path of racial separatism for some time. Race permeates all aspects of New Zealand politics. Your race determines how you can vote, what say you get in politics, what role you can play in politics, what services you receive and what you have to pay for them. New Zealand is a nation divided by race, two nations in one. It even has a name, co-governance. And it all started with an advisory body. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up to investigate Maori grievances about the Treaty of Waitangi and make recommendations to government. Sound familiar? In 1987, in a decision by New Zealand's highest court, it was held that the Treaty of Waitangi was binding on the government. And the court laid out various principles called treaty principles. One of those principles was the right of redress. If Maori have a legitimate grievance, the government must redress that grievance. But who decides if Maori have a legitimate grievance? The court held that the Waitangi Tribunal had that power and that its decision should be considered binding on the government. Let that sink in. In 12 years, the Waitangi Tribunal went from an advisory body to being binding. How long before our voice follows the same path? Now, someone might respond and say, well, things are different in New Zealand. They have the Treaty of Waitangi and we don't have anything like that. Well, that's true. We don't have a treaty yet. But we do have the High Court of Australia. And recent High Court cases in Australia suggest that we will go down the same path as New Zealand and the voice will become far more powerful than first contemplated. So yes, I fully expect that over time, the voice will have far more power than we are being told. My next precondition was that for the voice turning into a department of anti-racism is whether it will push an activist racial agenda. Let's return to the Waitangi Tribunal. Since it was granted binding political power, it has never failed to push an activist agenda. In its decisions, it has consistently pushed for special rights for Maori, the allocation of resources on the basis of race, and denounced any disparate outcomes between races. In one case, the tribunal held that Maori incarceration rates must be reduced relative to non-Maori in accordance with, and I quote, fixed targets. The implication is clear. The race of a perpetrator must be taken into account when sentencing criminal offenders. This is anti-racism in action, different laws for different races. I would assert that the Waitangi Tribunal acts indistinguishably from Ibram X. Kendi's Department of Anti-Racism. It looks for discrepancies in outcome between races and tries to stamp out racist ideas. Kendi would call it racial inequity. The tribunal calls it breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. It all amounts to the same thing. The tribunal even tries to punish wrongdoers, as Kendi proposed. In the Maori incarceration rates case, the tribunal suggested that if Justice Department officials don't meet their targets to reduce Maori incarceration, they must be, and I quote, held accountable. How Stalinist, punishing officials for not meeting their centrally planned targets. Australia will be the same. The proposed model for a voice, the so-called Karma-Langton report, was designed by activists for activists. It will be a Canberra-based voice. There will be no elections. just self-appointment from the activist class, people who already have a loud voice in the community. So we have 2 out of my 3 preconditions. The voice might become binding and will almost certainly push an activist agenda. What about the 3rd precondition? The undermining of democratic norms. I think we are seeing that with this very referendum debate. Firstly, there's the tone of this debate. Anti-voice advocates have been called everything from racists to rednecks to eugenicists. As well as calling us names, there's the unfair government funding, internet censorship, the government-funded propaganda education campaign, and the government's attempts to counter misinformation. The Australian Electoral Commission is teaming up with RMIT ABC Fact Check and AAP Fact Check to tackle misinformation. This is outrageous. These so-called fact-checking organisations are partisan political activists. It would be like the AFL giving the Collingwood cheer squad the ability to overturn umpiring decisions. It all depends if you barrack for Collingwood, I guess. It is totally inappropriate for an agency that runs our elections and is meant to be neutral to team up with partisan journalists. This referendum campaign is extraordinary. The polls are evenly split. Like most political debates in Australia, this will be a close-run thing. But despite the public being 50-50, all institutions of power in the country are in favour of the Yes campaign. The legal profession, much to my chagrin. Academia, the media, big tech, the sporting codes, the banks, most public companies, most of the not-for-profit sector, and of course the government itself, have all put their influence and dollars behind the Yes campaign. And those that speak out are denounced as racists. This is not a healthy state of affairs for a modern democracy, for all the institutions of power to be bludgeoning mainstream Australians into voting for their priorities. Now, maybe it won't be that bad. Maybe the voice won't be like Kendi's Orwellian Department of Anti-Racism. I don't know. But if the voice can only succeed through emotional blackmail, personal slurs, unfair funding, and censorship, even if it is successful, would it really represent reconciliation? Thanks for your attention. I'll hand over to Dan Wild.
Thank you, John, and thank you to Scott, and thank you to our chairman. It's so great to be with all of our members here today, and I'm very much looking forward to introducing Warren Mundine. Just before, when we were having a chat in the foyer, a couple of you mentioned the podcast that I have the privilege of hosting with IPA Distinguished Fellow Tony Abbott. And in one of the recent episodes, Tony talks about the Liberal Party and the idea of a Liberal Party as a broad church where all different sort of factions and elements of the tradition of the centre-right come together. And I thought, well, you could think of the Liberal Party that way, but I very much think of the IPA as a broad church. We've got thousands of members who think that Donald Trump should be the next president, and we've got thousands of members who think Ron DeSantis should be the next president. So we cover the field across the centre-right, and we're very much a tolerant, inclusive and welcoming organisation, so long as you're in one of the 2 camps. That's exactly right. Look, let me start by reading a couple of things out to you that I think you'll find interesting. I'm going to quote this to you. The analysis of the Institute of Public Affairs is, I quote, absurd and completely unfounded. This is from I assume it's a Mr. Richard Boast. He claims to be a law professor at Wellington's Victoria University in New Zealand. Here's another one. The Institute of Public Affairs analysis is, quote, incorrect, and it doesn't make sense. Now, that's from a lady called Claire Charters, who's law professor at Auckland University. Now, these quotes, just to reinforce what John said, these quotes came from a fact check from the RMIT ABC fact check unit. So these are two publicly funded organisations, RMIT University and of course our friends at the ABC. Now what's interesting about this fact check is, well, the word fact actually has a definition. It means, quote, a thing that is known or proven to be true. That is what a fact is. Now what's interesting is after this fact check by these partisan Yes campaigners, John, of course, outlined a very detailed letter as to why they were wrong, and they, a month later, replied to that letter, and they gave the game away. I'm quoting from the letter that they sent back to us defending their fake fact-checking. This is what they said. They admitted that they had used, quote-unquote, 3 experts who disagreed with the IPA. They went on to elaborate on this profound insight. Quoting experts is a completely legitimate form of fact-checking. Even if there are other experts who hold different interpretations or views, such as those expressed by the IPA, otherwise known as having an opinion. So this is the kind of fact-checking that we are being subjected to. Now I just want to give you one example of this issue. So as John mentioned in his extensive research of the New Zealand Maori voice to Parliament, now the reason we looked into this is because Anthony Albanese pointed to New Zealand as a model. There's still a tweet that he has up from early 2020 saying New Zealand has led the way when it comes to racial reconciliation. So this is what prompted us to look into New Zealand. And so our basic point is, look, New Zealand, their Maori voice to Parliament now effectively has a veto power over major decisions that come out of the Parliament. And those who oppose us and the fact checkers say, no, there's nothing to worry about. It's just an advisory body. They give advice, but of course, don't worry. The Parliament still has the ultimate authority. Now, what's interesting is the evidence that they use to support this claim. Now, they use one piece of evidence to support the claim. Remember, they're saying it's not a big deal. And the evidence they use is this. In the year 2020, on the back of a long-standing dispute, the Waitangi Tribunal ruled that a parcel of land should be granted from the New Zealand government back to the local Maori people in the area. Now, the government said no, because there was a critical power station on that land, and for obvious reasons, they thought that that needed to be in the possession of the government. Now, if that's where the story ended, that's fine. The Waitangi Tribunal gave its opinion, and the government said, thanks for your opinion, but we're going a different way. However, whilst the government said, no, we're not giving you that land, this is what they did give them. They issued an apology. They gave them $115 million of taxpayer funds. And they transferred 27 separate parcels of land to this local community. That was used as evidence to support the case that it's not a big deal. Now, this would be funny, and it is fun to make fun of them. However, there is a serious side to this. I hope you can see this. I'm going to hold this up here. You can kind of see that. So this is a post we put on Facebook. Now, this particular post is New Zealand's experience of legally entrenched racial division is a lesson for Australia and the path proposed by the Indigenous-only Voice. Now, this was John Storey on Rita Panahi on Sky News that we sought to promote. Now, you will have seen on here, you can't really see anything. It's all blurred out, as if it was some kind of obscene image. All blurred out. Now, why did they blur that out? Because it's false information, checked by independent fact checkers. Click here to see why. So these are the very same fact checkers who had a whole 3 experts who disagreed with us that are now actively censoring content on social media. So these fact checkers are a backdoor way of enforcing censorship through big tech and suppressing information, stopping the information of getting to the Australian people about what the voice to Parliament will mean for our nation. Now, there are many such examples of this, both from the IPA and other organisations in Australia. The question is, why are they doing this? And the answer is simple: because we're winning. They know that when Australians understand the truth about the voice, they are much less likely to support it. They know, for example, when Australians realise that the voice will be in the Constitution, and that means it's there forever, and that the Constitution is the rule book of our democracy. So when you change the Constitution, you change your democracy. Australians don't want it. when they learn that the High Court will be involved, that there will be decades of litigation. That's not the IPA saying that. That's former High Court Justice Ian Callanan, who said there'll be at least a decade of litigation from the Voice. Now, our Prime Minister says, well, no, the Voice won't be involved in the High Court. We can make assurances. Now, I admit I didn't pay full attention in all of my classes in civics, but maybe the Prime Minister was reading the Green Left Weekly, or maybe he was fighting Tories because that's what he does, or maybe he was reading speeches of his political hero Gough Whitlam on how to divide a nation and destroy an economy. I don't know what he was doing in his civics classes, but what I do know is there's a doctrine called the separation of powers. It's a cornerstone doctrine of democracy around the world. And what that doctrine says is the government of the day can't tell the High Court what it can or cannot be involved in on matters relating to the Constitution, for the simple reason that if they could, nobody could have confidence that the law would be applied impartially and fairly. And when Australians realise that the Voice is divisive, that it grants special legal privileges to one group of Australians based on their race, and therefore dilutes the privileges and rights of everybody else, they think twice about it. Or when they realise it will be involved in everything. That's what executive government means. It means setting interest rates. It means choosing High Court justices. It means on matters of defence, of welfare, of roads, of everything imaginable, the Voice will have a say. Or when they realise that actually this is not about recognition. Just because you're told that the Voice means recognition doesn't mean that it is. Recognition means recognising that Indigenous people were on this continent prior to European settlement. Now, we can agree or disagree whether a constitutional preamble to that effect is a good or a bad idea, but that's what recognition means. Having a massive new Canberra-based bureaucracy that's inserted into the Constitution and bricked in there forever is not recognition. Now, when Australians understand this, they don't back it in. I want to let you in on some new research we've got coming out shortly. We'll be releasing this research on Friday, and it goes to, John mentioned the Karma Langdon report. And why did we look at the Karma Langdon report? Well, whenever the Prime Minister or anyone in the Yes case is asked about the details, he says, just read Karma Langdon, just read Karma Langdon. He said it over 12 times. So we looked into the Karma Langdon report, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but I want to give you the greatest hits. So I hope you're ready to wait for a while, Warren, because it's quite a long list of greatest hits. So you're not just voting on one voice. Did you know that? You're voting on 36 voices. Did you know that? Not many people know that. There's a national voice, but then there's 35 local and regional voices. Well, that's interesting. Now, of course, all of these voices are going to be comprised of someone. Well, we know at the federal level, at the national voice, there'll be at a minimum 24 politicians in that voice. Now, if there's 24 politicians in the other 35 voices, and we have no reason to believe that there won't be, that means that there will be 864 more politicians established from this constitutional amendment. Now, someone has to work for these politicians. Now, every backbencher at a minimum has 5 staff. So let's assume that, well, surely the members of the Voice couldn't have fewer staff than the average backbencher. That would be unfair. So they'll all have 5 staffers. That's 4,000 staffers. That's just the direct staff. This isn't the bureaucracy, the massive apparatus. It's just the staffers. Now, they all get paid money. Believe it or not, they get paid. And the average politician gets in excess of 200 grand at a minimum. The average staffer gets something of 150 grand. So just looking at the staff costs, just the wage bill every year, it's over $600 million just to pay for the salaries of the politicians and their staffers. That's half of the annual funding for Northern Territory hospital system. The Karma Langdon report also gives the game away. The Voice is a preoccupation of inner city academics. Let me give you a couple of examples. We're told that the Voice is needed to alleviate Indigenous disadvantage, and every one of us wants to do that. But it's interesting for a document that claims to want to do that. For every one reference there is to disadvantage, there are 10 references to gender. The word inclusive is referenced 101 times. The word diversity, 97 times. Yet the word merit is mentioned twice. Guess how many times they mention democracy? Zero. In this document that our Prime Minister is assuring us is the basis of the voice to Parliament, not once does it use the word democracy, and that's because it's undemocratic. Now, the good news is Australians are seeing through this. You will have seen some polling recently which shows that support for the voice to Parliament is now a minority position in the community. Yes, it's only marginal, but it is now a minority position. Only 49% of Australians said that they would vote in favour of the voice in a poll. And that wasn't in the evil right-wing News Corp. That was published in the SMH and the Age. And three of those states, Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia, were no states. It's game over in that scenario. As you know, to get a change to the Constitution, you need a majority of people across the country, all people in every state and territory, plus you need to have a majority of states. So they need 4 states. The no case needs 3 states. Now that's despite, as John said, the millions of dollars in woke corporations, big tech censorship, all of the sporting codes, the civic organisations and all the plethora of other institutions in our society that are backing in the yes case. A couple of points that I just want to reflect on as I end, which is, firstly, the fact that this has gotten this far shows how brazen and how emboldened the left are. In 1967, 90% of Australians voted to remove references to race in our constitution. Back then it was considered to be racist to oppose removing references to race in the constitution. Now it's considered racist to oppose adding references to race in the constitution. Think about how much has changed in such a short space of time. They've become brazened and they've become emboldened. But that's why this is such a big opportunity for us. Yes, if we lose, our worst fears could be realised. But what if we win? If we win, it is a clear message from mainstream Australians that we believe in the Australian way of life, we believe in our values, we believe in equality, we believe that we should all be treated equal regardless of our background. It is a big opportunity for us to send a clear message to those in Canberra. As I was walking out of the office, just about to head out of the office, I got this email from our friends at GetUp. So I subscribe to GetUp's emails because you have to know what the enemy is thinking and doing. And I printed this off at 4:45 p.m, just a little while ago, and it filled me with lots of joy. And I'm going to read this out to you. So firstly, they say, latest polling results show the no campaign is leading. They then go on, their usual stuff. Then they say here, so they're getting worried about this, and they say, if we come together with First Nations communities to lead the country to a resounding, undeniable landslide, yes, it will do so much. Listen to this. It will do so much more than establish representation for First Nations people. It will send a message to our people across the continent that Australia is ready to start facing up to its colonial history and laying the groundwork for truth-telling and treaty. But listen to this part. But a loss in this referendum will no doubt set our work back by decades. Exactly. And so in terms of the effort to set back their work by decades, which I'm confident we can achieve, there's no better person than Warren Mundine to be here tonight. And it's my honour to be able to introduce Warren. Many of you know Warren as one of Australia's most highly influential and respected businessmen, political strategist and advocate of Indigenous empowerment through economic opportunity. Warren was National President of Labor, or the Labor Party, 2006 to 2007. In 2016, Warren was awarded the coveted Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to the community as a leader in Indigenous affairs and advocate for enhancing economic and social public policy outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Warren is a leading public intellectual in the argument against the voice to Parliament. And Warren is director of the Indigenous Forum at the Centre for Independent Studies, and he is author of the best-selling book, Warren Mundine in Black and White, Race, Politics and a Changing Australia. Warren, welcome.
That was some introduction. It's thanks for that, Dan. You know, I know why that video is going feral, because it is obviously a very good interviewer. But what an incredible a person that you're interviewing. Amazing, Blake. I want to meet him. Now you started this, so I'm going to do it myself. So the camera blokes like it. Here's my. You can see that, and that is a photo taken around 1916 to 1918. We're not too sure. It's amazing some of the archives and that cattle stations have, because at Nyunggai cattle station we got this photo where my family had been working on the cattle station since the 1840s, and is this bloke sitting up. The baby in that photo is my father, right? So and when you have these cattle stations, been in the family for a while, they have incredible archives that you can get. And of course, the man holding him is my grandfather, and then of course my grandmother is next to him. And this is obviously a family gathering on Nyunggai cattle station. And one of the things I look at is how this is sort of like a time machine as well, in that you see those two old women in the front. Now they must be, I'm guessing, in their late 50s or 60s or even probably older, which means they were born around 1850, 1860. And so what a life and what a change they would have witnessed in their time on this earth. That photo sits on my computer and it sits on my iPad as well as my phone. And it is something that guides me every time I turn my computer on, or I turn my phone on, or I turn my iPad on, because it reminds me of where I come from. It reminds me of the people who worked hard and fought hard for I can enjoy the life that I enjoy today because of their battles. They're very amazing people, because they always said to me, never ever be a victim. Never be a victim. Always strive in life for betterment for yourself and your family, and fight for equality. Because when that photo was taken, that was of course back around the First World War, there are many discriminatory laws in Australia. We can't dismiss them. You know, we had the Aborigines Protection Act in New South Wales and various versions of that across Australia, and we had the Aborigines Welfare Board in New South Wales, as well as other various things. One of the things I love when I was writing my best-selling book, thank you for that, and they're very reasonable price at every good bookstore and on Amazon and all other web pages you want to go to. In fact, I was at a function last night in Parramatta. I should have brought a whole case full of books here today, and we sold over 1,000 books that night. Yeah, so. That book I wrote, I was approached by Melbourne University Press because when I quit the Labor Party in 2012 and 2013, they approached me because they thought I could write a book about politics in Australia. And it come to my thought that really what they wanted to do was talk about dirt and stuff like that. I didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to talk about a story of Australia. And I was using myself and my family as the performers in that story. There's a bloke by the name of Edward Ogilvie who come up to my country, Bundjalung country in the northern New South Wales, and that was in the 1830s, the late 1830s. He was a bit of a visionary. He's a bit of a rogue as well, but one of the things he did, he sat down with one of my ancestors, Billy Balm, and they come to an agreement. I predict it was probably the first treaty agreement. And they decided this is what's Aboriginal land and this is what the cattle station's going to do. And my family worked on that cattle station as well from that 1830s, 1840s right up till today. They're still working on that cattle station. And they still own the land that was that they agreed with Edward Ogilvie. And in fact, I had a funny thing when I was in the Federal Parliament one day. John Anderson, the former Deputy Prime Minister, walked past me and he stopped and he said, "Warren." And I said, "What?" He said, "We come from the same place." And I started thinking, because one of my great ancestors was Irish, and I thought he must have been talking about Western Cork. Western Cork, of course, is where Michael Collins was shot, so one of my ancestors probably shot him as well. But he said, no, Yugabar cattle station. And I said, "Oh, how did you know about it?" And he said, "I'm a descendant from Edward Ogilvie." And I said, wow, how you going, cuz? Because, as I said about Edward, was a bit of a rogue. He had an Aboriginal wife for about 30 years. And so it's this journey we travelled upon, and we saw things, what's happening in Australia, and as the colony expanded and things moved forward. Some falsehoods that have been talked about in this voice campaign, I'd like to dispel at the beginning of my talk. And that is, Aboriginals had the voting right before 67. It was Menzies who in 1962 gave full voting rights to Aboriginals at the federal level. But voting rights also existed before that, depending on the geography where you were and the time. New South Wales, for instance, had voting rights from when elections were first set up, because the elections was you had to be, sorry ladies, you had to be male, you had to be over 21, and you had to be a British subject. So Aboriginals in New South Wales have been voting since the 1850s. In fact, when I was doing my book, I found in the archives rolls of my grandparents and great-grandparents actually voting around 1913 and 1900. South Australia was the same. In fact, in South Australia, that we know in the 1890s, where Aboriginals, women were given the vote. And it was funny, in the 1901 federal elections, Aboriginal women in South Australia voted. And there was polling booths and Aboriginal reserves for those Aboriginal women and for those Aboriginal men to vote. And that led to, of course, other states where women complained, saying, well, how come Aboriginals can vote in South Australia but we can't? And then 1902 onwards, women got the vote in Australia. Citizenship. That was also, before I go into citizenship, because we talk about Queensland and Western Australia, we talk about geographies, they actually took the vote away from Aboriginals in the 1890, and they didn't give them back till Menzies put the pressure on them, and that was in 1962 and 1965. And when people talk about the Constitution, I always think about the Constitution as a document that is a journey that provides a vision for a nation. And I talk about the Declaration of Independence in the United States, where, this is not the full wording, but it says that all men, sorry ladies, I missed out again, all men were equal under God. And it was slave owners who created that. But it wasn't about them being slave owners then. It was about a vision they saw for their nation, that everyone would be equal under God. And it was a discussion they had for many years, and it even ended up in a civil war and then onto the civil rights movement. So it was a vision. Yes, our Constitution had some racial clauses in them, but after the Second World War, there was a movement, and I call it was mainly founded by military people, because after serving in Papua New Guinea and being in prisoner of war camps in Changi and on the Burma Railway and fighting in North Africa and Greece and that, with their fellow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander soldiers who served with them, They come back after the war and they found out they couldn't have a beer with them. And they were not very happy about that. And this is when you started to get the campaign for full citizenship rights for Aboriginals. We were citizens, but we were second-hand citizens. And so it was a bloke by the name of Sir Paul Hasluck, a man of vision, who during the Second World War actually studied Aboriginal studies and learned about Aboriginal people. And he was a very keen man who worked with Menzies, and he made it very clear in the late 50s and the early 60s to the states and territories, because they had the laws that controlled Aboriginal people, that they have to change. That Aboriginal people could not be treated as second-class citizens anymore. They needed to have all the rights. And the Menzies government took that up with a cudgel and beat state governments over the head. So the 67 referendum was about equality, and it was about getting race out of the Constitution. Within 4 years of that 67 referendum, there was all the race laws in Australia disappeared, all the discriminatory laws. In fact, the last one in New South Wales was withdrawn in 1969. And then we went through a process of equality. How do we bring our Aboriginal brothers and sisters and Torres Strait Islanders to enjoy the fruits of citizenship of Australia? It was Gordon who brought in the Aboriginal Studies program, which was to help kids get to school and help kids get to university. When I was a young bloke, I was a kid in the 60s, I remember Charles Perkins and John Moriarty come to our town on their freedom rides, and I remember my parents and my elders in our community talking, wow, these two Aboriginal men, they've actually been to university. And we as kids thought, wow, that must be really important, what's a university? And now we've got doctors, engineers, accountants, professors of surgery, professors of law, professors of medicine. We've got a whole wide range of people now, and even lawyers. I don't know if that helps civilization, but anyway. Or even worse, yes, we even got Aboriginals in the parliaments now, politicians. But it was a journey. So for the last 56 years since the 67 referendum, the journey was about equality for all, about equality for opportunities. You can't make people equal. I'll tell you that now. You can open up opportunities for people and they can grasp those opportunities or not. And that's all you can do in a society. Some people will be mad, that, like myself, and they want to run a business, and other people will just want a job, and so on. So here was this incredible journey we're going on. And we've got Aboriginal Medical Service, Aboriginal Legal Service, we've got all these, and since 1973 we've had these advisory boards to government. Currently there's about 1,000 of them. Aboriginal sitting on these boards and Torres Strait Islanders advising government. In fact, I chaired one of those committees, which was, I had the flash title of the chairman of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council. And one of the things we did is we looked at the Closing the Gap program, and I was advisor to Malcolm Turnbull and to Tony Abbott. Where was economics in this? Where was economic development and where was business development? Because, my readings and that I don't know any race of people in the history of the world who've ever got out of poverty, about having an economy and having businesses and having commercial activities and everything happening. So when Tony Abbott approached me to do that, I said I want it to be an economic committee. So everything we did, whether it's health, education, whatever, it had to be focused on that issue of economic development within Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islands. We even twigged the Native Title Act and the Land Rights Act so Aboriginal people could own their own homes on their own land. Now, because we were in the bizarre position of Aboriginal people, even some Aboriginal people who worked in the mining industry and huge wages couldn't own their own home. And that was one of the things that changed my life and my family's life. After my father come back from the Second World War, Mum and Dad wanted to buy a house like every other Australian. But at the time, he was on an Aboriginal allowance. He didn't get to receive a full wage. But he didn't sit back and take that. He actually fought it and finally got a full wage paid, and in 1947, him and Mum bought a house. That little thing of buying a house changed our lives. It had a place where we could go every day. It was safe. It was a place for the family to be and live. It was a place that was an asset for us, and we grew up thinking that was normal. So the first thing I did when I left school was I worked in free jobs to raise my deposit and bought a house myself. And this is a generational thing. My kids are buying houses, and my kids also run businesses, and they do things because they grew up thinking that was normal to do these things. And this is the journey we've been going on as a country. I have a little saying. I have a lot of little sayings, but one of them is, I don't know any country in the world that had a very good beginning, no matter what, no matter how old they are or whatever, whether it was revolution or whatever. But what I judge a country on is how it overcomes its beginning, how it sets its vision for the future of what sort of nation that it wants to be and how its people are going to be treated. We always hear about this stuff about Australia being a racist country and that. And a good mate of mine, Anthony Dillon, always points out on Twitter, name a law that is against Aboriginal people. There's none. There's none. We haven't had one since 1970. In fact, we've done other things. We've set up land rights. We've set up native title. And when you look at that, over 50% of Australia's land mass is now owned by Aboriginal people. So this is the journey that we're going on, and I predict in the next few years it'll probably get to 70%. It's about us, everyone being treated equal, and about us, every citizen having the opportunities in it. And we see millions of people who want to come to this country. We've seen them come here in the millions after the Second World War, and all the migrants who come here, and refugees escaping Europe and other places around the world, and they helped build this economy. They worked hard. Some of them didn't have their qualifications recognised, so they worked in factories and they did things, and they got their qualifications finally recognised. And people are getting on boats to come to this country, risking their lives. You started with the Vietnamese after the Vietnamese War. And you've seen other groups of people doing the same things, risking their life to here. They're not risking their lives to come here so they could be racially abused and treated as second-class citizens. They see something that we've sort of lost in Australia. They see Australia as a free and liberty country. They see Australia with free speech. They see Australia with opportunities, economic opportunities, education opportunities, and things that their kids can live on and go well. So people talk about, okay, you're against the voice. Why are you against the voice? Because we've had the voice. In fact, currently we've got a voice which has, it's called the Coalition of the Peaks, and it sits at the National Cabinet. And they're complaining that they don't have a voice. There's 80 members of that Coalition of the Peaks. You had going right back to the Gough Whitlam's day, all these different bodies that we've had. So why is a body, and this is their words, that is only advisory going to be any different than the previous ones? And why does it need to be in our constitution? Simple questions. When they had the problems in Alice Springs, they still got the problems there today. And the Prime Minister and the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, were forced to go there because of the outcry by the media and the Australian public. They said, look, if we had a voice, this wouldn't happen. And so that brings up a couple of questions. The first one, of course, prove it. How do you prove that? And a number of other questions start raising. What's it look like? What's the design? And why is it in the Constitution if you've got the law now to set it up? And if it's going to be so wonderful and be the panacea of all, solving all our problems, then why aren't you putting it in law now, rather than waiting 2 or 3 years down the track where we've got more suffering and more problems? Why don't we start on the journey today? So this is why I don't trust them. They don't tell you what it is, how it operates, and they refuse to legislate it until it's in the Constitution. Now, what happens is the voice is defeated. We continue our journey that we started on in the 67 referendum. And I'll talk about one of the things we did when I was chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, and that is we set up a thing which is looking at, well, there's two things. We took 150 Aboriginal programs and we put them into 5: economics, land and economics, employment, health, education and so on. And that made a saving of us of paperwork of $56 million, which we put back into the Indigenous space so we could spend it on other things. We set up the business economy strategy, which started out on the 1st of July 2015. There were $6.2 million of contracts going to Aboriginal businesses at that time. As of a month ago, it's a $8.7 billion economy. It has created over 45,000 new jobs for Aboriginal people, 36% of that in regional and remote Australia. Over 3,600 businesses were created. This is the future. This is how you break down poverty. You give someone a job. You get investment on Indigenous lands where they can build businesses and they can do things. So there are a number of things we need to do, and that is, one is get back to the journey we started in 2017 about twigging the Land Rights Act and Native Title Act so people can actually get to own their own houses and that. Aboriginal people now realise that the only way they can get out of poverty is through projects and things happening on the land, and you're seeing the mining industry and the energy industry at that forefront. In the mining industry today, it's the biggest employer of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Over 7,000 people work in that industry. So when a person in Sydney or Melbourne tells you that Aboriginals hate mining, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. These are jobs, and these are skilled. You have to be a skilled worker, you have to have a university degree or a trade to work in these areas. And that's why we must continue this journey, because the voice is not going to fix anything. Our two speakers before us spoke about the bureaucracy that this is going to create. $380 million is on this campaign for the voice. $50 million we spent already. $50 million we're going to spend after the referendum. That's $480 million that we'd love to invest in education, that we'd love to invest into a number of other things that Aboriginal people need. I just find it in the last 2 years, 18 months, I've never heard so much racial abuse and abuse of fellow Australians than I ever heard even under the segregated society before 1967. This referendum was supposed to unite us and bring us together as a nation. And all it's done for the last 18 months is divide us, people abusing us. Apparently, according to Linda Burney's speech last night, I'm a Trumpist, and I'm bringing the evil politics of the United States here. We have fought for equality. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders fought for equality, and we got it, and we won after the 67 referendum. We need to keep equality. We do not want race back into the Constitution. We do not want one group of people having special powers over another group of people. We want to be treated like everyone else. And we want to take those opportunities that citizenship does in this country. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.